Hi, fourth graders. Welcome to Mitt and Minn's Illinois Adventure. This is the sequel to Mitt and Minn at the Wisconsin Cheese Jamboree that we read in the very beginning of the school year. And if you remember, it was a fun, exciting story about traveling through Wisconsin with the two mice, Mitt and Minn. And this new adventure takes them to our neighbor to the south, takes them to Illinois. And so the story will be similar to the Wisconsin Cheese Jamboree, where we will travel around Illinois, but the adventure is a little different. You should have received in your packet for the next 2 weeks, you should have received a sheet that looks like this, and then another booklet that looks like this. You are going to be using these as Mrs. B reads through Mitt and Minn's Illinois Adventure. You will answer questions that are written on this sheet. Okay, so the questions are on this sheet, but you will put your responses in the booklet. For example, today, you can fill out the information I want on the cover sheet. So this is the cover sheet, and then it's asking you, there are some questions in there about number one, illustration number one. So you'll put answer A here and answer B there. I went through the book and I picked out illustrations that I thought were, first of all, really good examples of falling action, rising action, climax in the book. And if you remember from the Wisconsin Cheese Jamboree, the illustrations in this novel, they are just as good as the one from the Wisconsin Cheese Jamboree. Such a great illustrator. So just fun, hopefully fun illustrations that I hope that you connect with. So without further ado, let's begin Mitt and Minn's Illinois Adventure. I'll show you the illustrations, then I will read from it. Chapter 1, Farewell, Jamboree. It was early evening, and the last visitor had left the Wisconsin Cheese Jamboree. The grounds were empty with the exception of one dairy farmer busily preparing his truck for the ride home to Illinois. Mitt and Minn were excited about the news that Lilka, the Jersey cow, had shared with them hours earlier. Lilka was from an Illinois farm, but had been at the Jamboree because she and 5 other Jersey cows had been entered into the dairy cow contest. When Lilka got to know Mitt and Minn, she realized that the pair of mice had parents living in Illinois on a farm not far from hers. She told them how their parents had arrived cold, wet, and tired, and that a mouse named Victor had helped them find a home nearby. Lilka promised Mitt and Minn that if they rode home on the truck with her, she would introduce them to Victor, and Victor could tell them where their parents were living. "Mitt," said Minn, "do you think we will make it all the way to Illinois with Lilka? Do you think our parents are really there?" Mitt was thoughtful before answering his sister. It was only hours earlier that the pair had learned other exciting news, that they were brother and sister. It had been a long day at the Cheese Jamboree, and Mitt thought it seemed like only yesterday that he was living in a mitten in the Mackinac State Forest of Michigan. When his mitten was stolen, he had no choice but to find it. The journey had taken him through places and dangers he never could have imagined. Now, nestled snug in a barn in Wisconsin with his long-lost sister, he was getting ready to leave for Illinois to be reunited with his parents. When he spoke, he said matter-of-factly, "Yes, Minn, I think we have both been through enough trials and dangers to get this far. Once we get to Lilka's farm, no matter what, we will find our parents. I do believe the hard part is over." At that moment, Mitt, the brave white-footed mouse from Michigan, had no idea just how wrong he would be. Chapter 2, Lilka's Farm. The Jersey cows were asleep in their stalls, soothed by the drone of the truck engine purring outside. The farmer was ready to leave now, and so he walked into the barn to begin loading the cows one by one. Mitt and Minn scrambled into the truck when it was Lilka's turn to enter. Once inside, they climbed on top of her back and rested there while the truck hummed along the freeway. It traveled through the quietest hours of the night, leaving Wisconsin and heading over the border into Illinois. Minn and Lilka were tired, and so they slept soundly while the truck hummed along. Mitt was tired too, but he could not sleep. He decided not to look out the rear window, but instead chose to look through the side window so he could think about where he was going and not where he had been. When they arrived at the farm, it was as lovely as Lilka had described. There were long white barns surrounded by rows of red geraniums and pretty Shasta daisies. There were straight white fences that made very square corners and a house with large windows and a bright red double door. The farm was outside of Moline, and there was a large painted sign above the barn door that read, "Nelson Farm, established 1862. Mitt and Minn could hardly contain their excitement when the back gate of the truck was lifted and the cows began to step out. Both mice chattered to Lilka, in the way that very happy mice will do, that they wanted to find Victor right away and ask him where their parents were living. Minn imagined her parents living on a farm as pretty as the Nelson farm. She began to think how nice it would be that, once they found them there, they could all live happily ever after in a setting as lovely as this one. The cows walked single file into the longest of the white barns, each stepping into a neat stall. The floors were painted a soft gray color, and the stall doors were painted white with red trim. There were silver buckets of all sizes sitting on a shelf that ran along the far wall, and each one was shinier than a new silver coin. Farmer Nelson made sure each Jersey cow had a good breakfast of summer grass, and then he left in the quiet way that he had arrived, closing the barn door behind him. The moment he did, Mitt and Minn sprang from the hiding and rushed to Lilka. "Where is Victor? We must talk to him right away." Lilka called for Victor in the way an old cow will call for a mouse. Victor was an eastern wood rat and an uncommon type of mouse for the area. He had settled at the Nelson farm years before, and he found it a good place to stay. There were always tiny things for him to collect and put in his nest. He found coins and marbles, hairpins and gumballs. One time he even found a small magnifying glass and put it near his bed. He pushed it upright against a nearby wall, and the next morning when he woke up, he looked straight through it and saw very large cows. He scared himself so much that he hid the glass and never took anything like that again. When the cows asked him what happened to the spyglass, Victor, not known for telling the truth at all times, told them another wood rat must have taken it and carried it far away. As Lilka kept calling for Victor, Minn decided to tour the barn. He walked the edge of the shelf with the silver buckets, going behind them to search for crumbs. She was very careful, paying attention not to get too near to them. Mitt stayed near Lilka, turning his face from side to side to see if Victor was coming. Minn was behind one bucket when all of a sudden, crash! The buckets started falling off the shelf one by one, beginning at the farthest end. Minn had no idea why this was happening, and so she jumped from the shelf and began to scurry back to Mitt. As she turned around, there was another mouse behind her, a bit larger and darker, with an older face. He looked as if he were running from himself, carrying a diamond ring in his mouth. He ran straight to Luca, unaware of Minn's presence. When he reached the Jersey cow, he came to a sudden halt, dropping the ring at her feet. Victor, Chapter 3. Victor! Luca cried out in a way a surprised cow will do. Where have you been, and what have you taken now? Victor began to explain that he had been in Farmer Nelson's home and in his pantry. He said he spotted the shiny object in a little dish on top of a sugar canister, and he couldn't help but take it with him. His whiskers twitched as he spoke, for his heart was still rushing with fright. He continued to explain to Luca that Farmer Nelson had opened the pantry door and spotted him. He had to run as fast as he could out the knothole in the front door and into the barnyard, past the chickens and into the barn. Why, Victor, said Luca, that must be Mrs. Nelson's wedding ring from long ago. He misses her so very much. You must return that at once. Luca was so busy scolding Victor that she forgot all about Mitt and Minn and their quest for their parents. Victor was unaware of the guests too, until he took notice of something behind Luca. As he did, Luca remembered the mice and changed the subject. Victor, these are Mitt and Minn. I met them at the cheese jamboree. They are looking for their parents, and I think you may know where their parents are living. Victor crept in closer, nosing in at Minn. He put his face to hers, and then he turned to look at Mitt. They look just like them, laughed Victor, spitting images of both of them. Mitt and Minn wanted to believe him, but after all they had seen and heard so far, they didn't know if he was telling the truth. A dark feeling came over Mitt that maybe Victor was fibbing and knew nothing about their parents. As the four of them stood quietly in the barn, Minn stepped away from Mitt and went front and center to Victor. He drew a deep breath and spoke. Do you really know our parents? Why, yes, he snorted. I said so, didn't I? Then where are they? Responded Minn. Victor settled himself into a tuft of hay beside Luca's foot, the stolen ring still nearby. Your parents came here by mistake. Your mother told how long ago you were all living in a nest tucked into a discarded barn boards out in the middle of the forest. One evening a bobcat had discovered the nest and was making his hungry intentions known, and so she had to take you children from the nest and place you in a safe spot away from the danger, because that is what white-footed mice do in times of trouble. Your father stayed at the nest while your mother moved you one by one, and after she was sure that each of you was safe and sound, she and your father were squeezing their way out of the barn boards. In an instant, the two of them were scooped into a pile of debris and dropped into an old truck. Your mother said that, at that moment, the truck drove away, taking them and the barn boards with it. 3 days later, they showed up here, drenched from rain and frightened by thunder and lightning. The truck had come here to deliver old boards to Mr. Nelson so he could use them for making old-fashioned picture frames. And here's an illustration of Victor telling the story. I just love that illustration. Can you just imagine Mitt and Minn listening to Victor telling that? Mitt and Minn were interested in the story, but yet did not totally believe Victor. So how do you know him then? Huffed Mitt. Well, I can tell just by looking at you two, replied Victor. Oh, you can you? Snarled Mitt, now impatient and tired of swelling with disbelief. I don't believe a word that you are saying. Victor turned away and scrambled into his nest, which was tucked into the far corner of Loca's stall. Moments later, he was back with a long piece of red wool yarn in his mouth. Your mother gave me this. She said she grabbed it before she was dropped out of the truck. It's from your nest. Mitt and Minn nosed in on the yarn, sniffing it, mouthing it, and exploring it all the ways that mice will explore. As Mitt did, he could smell the sweet scent of his mother. He could almost hear her voice singing to him in the warm, snug nest they had shared long ago. Minn also could tell it belonged to their mother, as the yarn was the exact shade of red as the mitten that Gertie had saved from the basket of cherries. Mitt and Minn felt badly that they had doubted Victor. Mitt spoke first. Can you tell us where they are? Can you help us to get there? Victor replied in a half-hearted manner, insulted by their initial lack of trust. I can tell you where they are. They are living on a farm not far from here. I could take you there if you want me to. Mitt and Minn wanted Victor to lead them to the farm right away. Mitt's heart was bursting with longing for his parents, and Minn felt a gentle warmth sweeping over her that reminded her of quiet nights in Gertie's cabin, tucked into a teacup and nibbling on oatmeal cookie crumbs. So let's go, urged Mitt, thanking Loca for her help as he nudged Victor toward the barn door. Just then the barn door opened. As it swung wide, Mitt, Minn, Victor, and Loca watched as Farmer Nelson walked inside, a handkerchief in his hands. The corners of his eyes were glistening, not from joy or laughter, but from the wetness of tears. He nosed around the barn, a bit as if looking for something, and then sadly wiped his face with the handkerchief and slowly walked out. Loca spoke first and directly to the wood rat. You must return the diamond ring to the house before you go, Victor. You must do that, or I will not let you return to your nest ever. With that, Loca stomped her foot, and Victor tried to peek around it, looking at his home, where all his special treasures were stored. Victor spoke to Mitt and Minn. If you help me to return the ring safely, then I will take you to your parents. Minn looked at Mitt. She tried to read the soft look on his face, and from it she knew that Mitt was afraid and disappointed at the same time. Even so, Mitt said nothing of his feelings to Minn. Instead, he told Minn that they must help Victor, not only because they had insulted Victor when he was telling the truth, but because if the wood rat did not return from the farmer's house safely, they would never find their parents. There was no other choice in the matter. So that's the end of chapter 3. The next video I will share will be chapter 4, and we'll find out, do they get the ring back, and do they finally get a chance to meet their parents? Bye-bye, 4th graders.